Hey, how's life? This is the Best of Literature, number 99, Metamorphoses by the Roman poet Ovid. It was published in 8 AD, so I'm just diving right into this. So this one is part of a series. We're just doing the best of literature as determined by a list on greatest something. Now I can't remember what the list was, but they compiled like 140 different lists to try to determine what is the definitive list of all the greatest works in the history of literature. And this one is number 99. It's the Metamorphoses by Ovid. It was originally written in Latin. It contains about 250 myths. And just to give you some context, here's what some criticism said about it. They tend to say that it doesn't particularly fit any one genre. It's been described as an epyllion, which is a short narrative poem that shows affinity for epic, but is not actually epic proper. So that means it doesn't actually arrive at the area of epic that we see, like the Iliad, Odyssey, those kinds of epics. It doesn't really get there, but it has an affinity for it. It's approaching that. It's approximating it. It's stepping up on it. Quote, metamorphosis, mutability, love, violence, artistry, and power are just some of the unifying themes that critics have proposed over the years, end quote. So these are some of the things that you see throughout this thing. Accompanying this theme is often violence, inflicted upon a victim whose transformation becomes part of the natural landscape. This theme amalgamates the much-explored opposition between the hunter and the hunted, and the thematic tension between art and nature. Fascinating theme, of course, but this book, and as I'll talk about when I talk about whether I recommend it or not, it's erratic. There's a lot going on, and there's not generally an overarching narrative that's going to pull it all together. You've got themes like change and art and nature and hunter and hunted and that kind of thing that kind of pull it together in that way, but generally it doesn't have the kind of spoon-fed narrative that is much appreciated, and actually I desperately wanted when I was reading this thing. It was just difficult to grasp onto anything. Some of the images were great, and the writing was fun to read in a lot of places, but it was difficult to really sink your teeth into. It was much of the problem that the Decameron had, except in a different way. Like, the Decameron was all frivolity and jest and sex and nonsense sitcom stuff. It had some more serious stuff, but this one's more serious stuff. It's got harsher things going on. So, as I said, a lot of the themes center around the ideas of change and violence in nature. Here's a quote from it. Quote, the head she had sprinkled sprouted the horns of a lusty stag. The neck expanded. The ears were narrowed to pointed tips. She changed his hands into hooves and his arms into long and slender forelegs. She covered his frame in a pelt of dappled buckskin. Last she injected panic. End quote. So that's what you see a lot of descriptions, and wonderful descriptions. They're enjoyable to read. Descriptions of change, of transformation, the mutability of the characters. I wonder if that's kind of a pan to adaptability in general, like it shows an affection for natural selection, evolution, or something. I don't know. Maybe that's what the backbone of this whole work is. I don't know. So some of my thoughts on it was, like I said, erratic. It was really hard to derive a larger import when you're reading it. It's just a bunch of stories, collected stories, where a bunch of stuff is happening and people are having conflicts and changing and transforming and becoming other things and all that, but it was difficult to kind of pull something out of it. Some of my favorite names from the gods that were referenced: Arachne. I mean, that one's, it's Arachnid, Arachne. I kind of like it. Niobe. And obviously anybody who hears that, I'm sure, because we're nerds, is going to think of The Matrix. But I just like the name. It's a good name. Daedalus. I've heard that. Daedalus? Have I heard that pronounced otherwise? I think it's Daedalus. That's how I've always pronounced it. Perdix. I hadn't even heard that one before. Hecuba. I've experienced that in Hamlet, of course. Who's he to Hecuba? I think talk about Hercules or something. Circe, and that's, of course, what are we going to think of? We're going to think of Game of Thrones, but still, it's a good name. Good name. And honestly, she's probably my favorite character in that show. That probably goes a lot to say something about personality, but anyway, maybe we'll talk about Game of Thrones at some point down the line. And Romulus, I love the character just in the historical quote, historical character of Romulus. It's fascinating. And I am reading right now a book on Norse mythology by Neil Gaiman. Gaiman? It's I should know how to pronounce this, but I always say Neil Gaiman No, do I say Gaiman or Gaiman? I don't know what I say. But anyway, he writes it, and it's fantastic. It's on Norse mythology, and it has such incredible stories that I've never heard before. My favorite, there's so many good ones. They're just like giants and Thor and Loki being all crazy and Odin, and oh my gosh, it's so good. My introduction to Norse mythology comes from Final Fantasy VII, but still, it's nice getting a little deeper into it, and Fenrir is my favorite character in that. Oh my gosh, I love it. I would highly, highly, highly recommend that. If anybody stumbles upon it, it's the book on Norse mythology. I think it's just called Norse mythology. Maybe a subtitle or something like that. It's written by Neil Gaiman, and it is fantastic. I love it. So don't just watch the Thor movies. Just read this book. It's great. It's wonderful. Some quotes from this particular book, Metamorphoses. Of course, it makes sense. I would reference Norse mythology within Metamorphoses when I'm doing a review of that. Quote, I grabbed a pile of dust and holding it up foolishly asked for as many birthdays as the grains of dust. I forgot to ask that they be years of youth. End quote. So a funny little concept there. Quote, happy is the man who has broken the chains which hurt the mind and has given up worrying once and for all. End quote. Good advice. Quote, be patient and tough. One day this pain will be useful to you. End quote. Kind of approximating Nietzsche's quote. Whatever doesn't kill you will make you stronger. It is incredible. A lot of the things that he said, my favorite quotes of him have to do with the staring too long to the abyss, and the abyss stares back into you. I can't remember my favorite formulation of that. But this one approximates one of his quotes, but the whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger quote, that has permeated the hell out of culture. Everybody says that. So good on Nietzsche. God is dead. A lot of good stuff from Nietzsche. Try reading. I've read Genealogy of Morals several times, and I don't know if I pick out any ideas from it, but I sure love reading it. The idea of Christianity inverting all the weaknesses to make them strengths, which is incredibly informative to what's going on right now, to be honest. That idea I pulled out of it, but other than that, there's not a whole lot that I get out of Nietzsche when it comes to fundamental philosophical ideas. Will to power, sure, but still, there's not a whole lot that's all that substantive that I think informs on my philosophy now, or that I would think would be revolutionary related to everybody else's philosophy. If I want something that's groundbreaking, I'm gonna go to Wittgenstein. Anyway, what am I talking? Oh, who cares? I don't know. I like Wittgenstein. Anyway, so we were talking about some quotes. Who gives a quote? Everything changes, nothing perishes. End quote. So I'm sure it's a sentiment that comes from all sorts of cultures all over the place. I'm sure, but still. Important idea. Quote, when he, whoever of the gods it was, had thus arranged in order and resolved that chaotic mass and reduced it, thus resolved, to cosmic parts, he first molded the earth into the form of a mighty ball, so that it might be of like form on every side, and that no region might be without its own forms of animate life. The stars and divine forms occupied the floor of heaven. The sea fell to the shining fishes for their home. Earth received the beasts, and the mobile air the birds. Then man was born. Though all other animals are prone and fixed their gaze upon the earth, he gave to man an uplifted face and bade him stand erect and turn his eyes to heaven. End quote. Good stuff. I don't know how it compares really to Genesis. I don't like the writing in Genesis all that much. If you go King James, of course, it's a little more ornate, but Genesis is a little goofy, a little hackneyed, a little sloppy. I enjoy this writing more, but still, Genesis has its merits. It has its merits when it comes to world creation stories. Plus, this one just abdicates the idea of which god did the forming, whereas Genesis just goes for it. It's just like, it was this god, or this, technically this collection of gods. Elohim. Well, I don't even know, because Genesis came after a lot of the other books that actually do reference plural gods. So I'm not sure if in Genesis it was still considered a plural when they were talking about God forming the heavens and the earth. Anyway, quote, Venus of Eryx from her mountain throne saw Hades and clasped her swift-winged son and said, Cupid, my child, my warrior, my power, take those sure shafts with which you conquer all and shoot your speedy arrows to the heart of the great god to whom the last lot fell. When the three realms were drawn, your mastery subdues the gods of heaven, and even Jove subdues the ocean's deities and even him who rules the ocean's deities. Why should hell lag behind? Why not there too extend your mother's empire and your own? Then Cupid, guided by his mother, opened his quiver of all his 1,000 arrows, selected one, the sharpest and the surest, the arrow most obedient to the bow, and bent the pliant horn against his knee, and shot the barbed shaft deep in Pluto's heart. End quote. Jeez, Pluto can't get a break. Just not a planet, and then gets shot in the heart by Cupid. Shot in the heart. But anyway, just reading that right now makes me want to reread this, actually. I think I enjoyed that. That was fun stuff. And it's got a whole bunch of those kinds of stories. And maybe rereading this or reading this Norse mythology book, maybe that's piqued my interest in mythology in general. But I remember, I think it's got the story. And full disclosure, I had to go find some quotes because when I went back to my version, I got like 5 different versions of Metamorphoses. I try to get them free where I can, but I got like 5 different versions on my iPad, and I went through, and as I was reading, I'd highlight. As I was reading, I would highlight. But in this particular case, for some reason, I went through all the ones that I had, and I couldn't find any of my highlights. So I had to go and find some quotes that approximated the quotes that I saved or that I would have saved from what I remember. So these quotes are good, but they're not the ones that I necessarily would have used if I had done it properly, or if I could find where I kept all my highlights. So, but that's good. It's that was an excellent quote that exhibited kind of what this book is about and what happens, and the kind of writing you can look forward to, and all of that. I'm not sure what translation I read, but it was a good translation. So sorry, I can't help you on that front. Anyway, so my recommendation, as I stated earlier, it's disjointed. It doesn't have that big narrative that's gonna all congeal into a grand idea and a grand story that's gonna resonate in your brain. But there are gonna be stories that stand out. One story that always particularly stands out to me is Daedalus with Ariadne and the Minotaur and the one who's stuck. Who's the one who's stuck in there? How come I cannot remember the one who's stuck in the freaking maze? That's ridiculous. But anyway, I like the idea. I like that whole story is wonderful. So overall, after having read that quote, I would recommend reading the book. Like I said, you're not going to get as much out of it as you're going to get from a lot of other works if you have shortened time to maybe wait for one of the later ones on this list. But it's worth a read, even if you just pick it up and do some chunks here and there, because like I said, you're not going to drop the narrative in your brain and then have to pick it back up. It's a lot of disjointed stuff together. And there were a lot of times, and everybody does this from point to point, when you're reading, where you'll read for a while and not be getting anything, you'll be thinking of something else, and that happened to me a few times when I was reading this, so take that for what you will. Anyway, so that's number 99. That's Metamorphoses by Ovid, and we're making our way up to 100 amidst all the other things that are going on here. So let me know what you think. You can email me at thelastcoffeehouse@gmail.com, or you can go onto the Facebook page, The Last Coffee House. You can tweet at me at CoffeeChatLCH. Whatever the case, I would greatly appreciate any kind of communication, discussing any of this stuff, positive, hostile, anything else. I don't care. Whatever you want to say, I'm happy to read it. So thank you very much.